Umbrella didn't make one monster, they made a production line. Every Tyrant on this list was built with a purpose, failed in a specific way, and made the next one more dangerous because of it. From the one that couldn't even lock onto a target to the one that came the closest to Umbrella's actual dream. Let's get into it. Before the ranking starts, there's something worth knowing about what a Tyrant even is, because most people get this wrong. A Tyrant is not just a big zombie. A zombie is what happens when the T-virus spreads without any direction. So when Umbrella takes that same virus and applies it to a very specific kind of human host under controlled conditions with a defined outcome in mind. The key detail most people skip: only about 1 in 10 million people naturally carry the genetic compatibility factor required to survive the Tyrant transformation. That is not a wide pool to recruit from. Umbrella was not just injecting random subjects. They were hunting for the rare few whose biology could absorb the virus without completely falling apart. Starting at the bottom, ranked last on the entire list, is the T-001, and if you judge it as a weapon, forgetting it exists is not even a mistake. It was not a weapon, it was a question. Umbrella needed to know whether the concept was biologically possible at all before spending billions developing it further. The T-001 answered that question. Yes, the idea works. But yes came attached to a staggering amount of problems. The T-001 was so unstable that Umbrella couldn't reliably point it at a target and expect it to engage that specific target. Combat endurance was essentially non-existent. The physical structure degraded under stress in ways that made it useless for any real deployment scenario. What's easy to miss is that the T-001's failure actually forced Umbrella to completely rethink host selection criteria. The compatibility requirements they identified from studying why the T-001 broke down became the filtering system every later Tyrant program was built on. Without this catastrophic first attempt, the research team doesn't know what questions to ask going into the next prototype. For a research team, this was a significant data point. For a weapons division trying to land military contracts, it was a dead end with legs. Think of it like the first rocket that exploded on the launch pad. Total failure. The T-002 is where the Tyrant line starts looking like something. Most original Resident Evil fans recognize this one immediately because it's the final boss of the first game. The pale, enormous clawed figure with that exposed heart sitting right in the middle of its chest. Director Shinji Mikami has talked about wanting the final confrontation in the original game to feel like facing the ultimate monster, and the T-002 was the result. It had been stored under the Spencer mansion for years, kept alive and in stasis while Umbrella waited for the right moment to deploy it. What made the T-002 a genuine step forward was its stability. The process had been refined enough to produce something that could function in combat, maintain structural cohesion under stress, and operate in an enclosed space with real intent behind its movement. But the heart is the problem. Designing a bioweapon where the single most critical vulnerability sits completely exposed on the outside of the body is such a ball drop type of failure, so dumb. In hindsight, it's almost impressive. Any trained soldier puts every round into that chest and the engagement is over in seconds. What this flaw actually revealed to Umbrella's research team was that the T-virus mutation was prioritizing biological power output over structural logic. The body was getting stronger from the outside in, but the internal restructuring wasn't keeping pace. That discovery reshaped how every later model approached the relationship between mutation depth and physical armor. Umbrella knew it the moment testing began, and so they kept going, which is really the story of the entire program compressed into one sentence. The T-078 doesn't get talked about enough, and that gap in the conversation actually matters for understanding how Umbrella operated. This model appears in Resident Evil Code Veronica, activated on Rockfort Island, and what it represents is more important than what it does in the game. Umbrella was never running a single sequential line of development. They were running multiple research branches simultaneously, testing different configurations, different host profiles, and different mutation targets at the same time. The T-078 is a more refined combat Tyrant that addresses the stability issues plaguing the earlier models. The improvements are real and measurable, but they're incremental, not transformative. Something worth noting here is that side game Tyrants like the T-078 consistently carry lore weight that rivals the mainline entries. The franchise built most of its deepest research detail into games that casual players skipped entirely, and the T-078 is one of the cleaner examples of that pattern. Umbrella's entire parallel research structure only becomes visible when you look at the full picture across every entry. It sits in the middle of this list because that is exactly where it lives in the development timeline, doing the grinding, unglamorous work that makes everything above it possible. Tyrant R barely shows up in fan conversations, and skipping it leaves a real gap in understanding where the program went next. This one comes from Resident Evil Survivor, a game with a limited legacy, which is probably why it gets overlooked, but lore-wise, Tyrant R marks a meaningful shift in design philosophy. The question stopped being how do we make it stronger and started being how do we make it useful for a specific task. That change sounds subtle. It is not. Early Tyrants were theoretically all-purpose and practically uncontrollable. Tyrant R was built around a defined operational profile, with tactical aggression and mission compatibility as primary targets rather than raw physical ceiling. This is actually the point in the timeline where Umbrella stops treating the Tyrant program purely as a research exercise and starts treating it like a product line with clients in mind. Task-specific engineering requires a completely different research mindset than brute force scaling, and the fact that Umbrella could make that pivot at all reflects how much institutional knowledge had built up by this point in the program. The most interesting parts of this franchise are consistently buried in the material most people never go looking for. T-103 broke the program wide open, and most people know it as Mr. X. The trench coat, the footsteps through the ceiling, the way it does not stop no matter what you throw at it. But here's the detail that actually makes Mr. X terrifying beyond the gameplay experience. He is not one of a kind. He is unit number 1 in a production run. Umbrella deployed at least 10 T-103 units to Raccoon City during the outbreak. 10. The T-103 was the first Tyrant line to reach genuine mass production, which means Umbrella had finally cracked the formula enough to manufacture them at scale, rather than producing experimental one-offs in a research lab. 1 Mr. X is a serious problem. 10 is a different scale of disaster entirely. About that coat, the game files actually label it a power limiter, and that label is accurate. The mutation inside the T-103 does not stop progressing at the point Umbrella needed it to stop. Left unsuppressed, it would push past the combat functional threshold into something too unpredictable to deploy. The coat physically suppresses that progression, keeping the Tyrant in a stable enough state to operate across multiple engagements without destabilizing. The moment the coat comes off is not dramatic flair. The limiter is gone, and the biology starts doing what it has always wanted to do. Shinji Mikami has said in interviews that the original design goal for the RE2 Pursuer was simple, something that should feel unstoppable, relentless, and immune to the normal rules of the game. The T-103 delivered that, and the franchise has been chasing that feeling in every Stalker enemy since. Thanatos is the model that proves Umbrella never fully learned from its own mistakes. It comes from Resident Evil Outbreak, and the backstory here is actually wild. Thanatos was not developed by Umbrella's main research division. It was created by Dr. Greg Mueller, a rogue Umbrella researcher who modified his own strain of the T-virus specifically to push the Tyrant formula past the ceiling that the T-103 had established. Mueller wanted a Tyrant with higher aggression output and greater physical threat at baseline. He got it. Thanatos is measurably more dangerous than Mr. X in raw combat terms. The problem is that the operational reliability that made Mr. X deployable got sacrificed in the process. A Tyrant that exceeds its parameters and starts selecting its own targets is not a weapon anymore. It's a liability, and now someone has to manage that liability on top of whatever the original mission was. What makes Thanatos particularly damning as a case study is that Mueller was not a rogue outsider. He was an Umbrella insider with full access to company research, and the organization's own culture of escalation is what pushed him toward making something more powerful without thinking through the cost. Stronger without discipline is just a more expensive failure, and Thanatos is the clearest proof of that on this entire list. Ivan consistently surprises people because the function doesn't match the expectation. Say, Tyrant and most people picture something trying to kill you in a hallway. Ivan was built to keep someone alive. This model appears in Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles, and the lore detail that most people miss is that two Ivan units were created, Ivan the First and Ivan the Second, and they served as personal bodyguards for Umbrella founder Oswell E. Spencer himself. Spencer, the man who built the entire company, chose a Tyrant derivative as his personal protection. That tells you everything about how far the program had come in terms of behavioral control and deployment flexibility. Ivan was engineered around protection, loyalty, and enough discipline to operate in close proximity to a specific asset without becoming a threat to that asset. The existence of Ivan also reveals something about Umbrella's client pitch that most people never consider. If you can sell a government a battlefield tyrant, you can also sell them a Tyrant-class security detail for heads of state. Getting a bioweapon with the physical capacity to tear through concrete to function as a bodyguard rather than a berserker is a genuinely difficult engineering problem, and Umbrella solved it well enough that Spencer trusted his life to the result. The Tyrant line had gone from unstable prototype to viable personal security in a relatively small number of iterations. That is an uncomfortable level of progress. Nemesis sits near the top for one reason, and that reason is the NE alpha parasite. What most people don't realize is that the parasite itself has a degree of sentience. It doesn't just bond with the host, it integrates into the nervous system and effectively co-pilots the Tyrant, contributing active intelligence to what would otherwise be a base T-103 frame. The Nemesis program was developed by Umbrella's European branch, working separately from the American research teams, and the goal was specifically to solve the problem that no previous Tyrant had solved: sustained targeted pursuit of a specific high-value target with enough cognitive function to adapt when the direct approach stops working. The result tracks targets across an entire city. It reads movement patterns and anticipates positioning rather than just reacting to what's in front of it. It operates rocket launchers and tentacles with tactical intent. When one approach fails, it does not repeat the same sequence. It finds a different angle. The Raccoon City deployment against Jill Valentine is not a system running on instinct. It is a system running on something close enough to strategy that the distinction barely matters. Mr. X follows you through a building because that's where you are. Nemesis follows you across a city because it figured out where you were going next. Hypnos T-type is where the concept of a Tyrant's threat ceiling stops being a fixed number and starts being an open question. This model comes from Resident Evil Dead Aim, and it was created by Umbrella researcher Morpheus D. Duval after he went completely off script following being dismissed from the company. What Duval built into Hypnos was not just high baseline capability, he built in escalation as a feature. The mutation cycle in Hypnos is not a stress response or an accidental biological outcome, it is engineered behavior. Every phase of combat was designed to end with Hypnos in a stronger physical configuration than it entered. The longer the encounter, the more advantaged the Tyrant becomes, which means engaging it in a sustained fight is exactly what the weapon was optimized for. Nemesis adapts in response to pressure applied from outside. Hypnos adapts on a timer regardless of what's happening around it. The biological sophistication required to engineer scheduled escalation into a T-virus host's mutation cycle puts Hypnos further along the research curve than almost anything else on this list. Fame and actual danger are not the same measurement, and this ranking is about danger. Talos is not a tyrant in the way most people use that word. The name stands for Tyrant Armor Lethality and Offensive System, and that name is doing a lot of work. This is the point in the program where Umbrella stopped asking whether they could make a Tyrant function in combat, and started asking whether they could build a full military weapons platform using biological material as the engine, integrated weapon systems, layered mechanical and biological defensive capacity, a design built entirely around sustained military engagement rather than facility containment or targeted elimination. The critical distinction that separates Talos from everything below it on this list is not raw power, it is intent. Every previous Tyrant was engineered to survive a battlefield encounter. Talos was engineered to dominate one. That shift from survival to dominance as the primary design target is what makes it qualitatively different, not just stronger. Earlier Tyrants were bioweapons with combat applications. Talos is a war machine that happens to be partially alive. You don't deploy it to deal with a problem in a building. You deploy it when the problem requires something positioned between a Tyrant and a tank. That is not an experiment anymore. That is a fulfilled defense contract, which was the dream Umbrella was selling from the very beginning of the program. Here's what nobody talks about when they rank these things. Every Tyrant on this list failed, not in the sense that they were weak, but in the sense that none of them delivered exactly what Umbrella promised at the start of the program. The T-001 couldn't be aimed. The T-002 had its most critical weakness sitting on the outside of its body. The T-103 needed a coat to stay functional during deployment. Nemesis relied on a parasite that introduced its own instability into the system. Thanatos lost control before it could be useful. Yvonne worked, but was limited to one very specific operational context. Talos was the most complete answer Umbrella ever produced, and it existed inside a company that collapsed before it could be deployed at scale. The goal kept moving every time Umbrella got close to it. Every new model was one step toward the answer, and also proof that the answer required one more step. Which brings up the question the franchise has never fully answered. If Umbrella hadn't collapsed when it did, if the program kept running at the pace it was going with the lessons from every failure on this list feeding back into the next iteration, what comes after Talos? Because based on the pattern across every model here, the next one would have been faster, smarter, more stable, and built to address every specific failure point we just walked through. It would have the behavioral control of Yvonne, the tracking intelligence of Nemesis, the escalating evolution of Hypnos, and the weapons integration of Talos, all inside one frame, in a production run of 10 or more. And given how quietly the T-103 units were deployed to Raccoon City before anyone knew what was happening, there's a real chance nobody would have seen it coming at all.